Hello, Uhuru, and welcome to the breakdown. I am Yejide Owumila. I'm the president of the African National Women's Organization and host of this show. And today I will be joined by Layla-Roxanne Hill, writer, co-author of Black Out There, and organizer based in Scotland. The breakdown is being brought to you by the African National Women's Organization, a mass organization under the African People's Socialist Party. It is a monthly news and analysis and opinion platform that highlights invited guests whose issues highlight the plight of colonized women struggling against colonialism and what they are doing in those places to really win that fight. Again, my name is Yejide. I am joined by Coco Lewis, who will be the moderator and MC for today's broadcast. I'm also joined by Jay Amechi, who is our volunteer and producer, who has joined our show. I'm so excited about that. And she is based in Portland, Oregon. Today's guest is Layla-Roxanne Hill, who's a writer, a curator, and organizer living in Scotland. Her work focuses on anti-colonial cultural contributions and the way our conditions move us to act. She is active in the trade union movement, holding elected positions with the National Union of Journalists and the Scottish TUC. And she'll tell us what TUC is. And she is a member of the Glasgow Film Theatre Board. So I just want to welcome Layla to our show. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. So I just want to, before we get started, I just want to say that I found out about Layla because in AMWO we are always trying to reach out and see what African women are doing in different places around the world. And so I came across your profile on Twitter. I'm like, oh, she's interesting. So I was just like, let's get her perspective and let's see what's going on in Scotland. You don't really hear too much about Black people in Scotland, and we know that Black people are everywhere. So and I think that your book, we could talk a little bit more about that along the conversation, can kind of tell people like what the experiences are and what you hoped to accomplish with that book. And um, but yeah, I just want to welcome you. And if you could just give yourself your own brief introduction. I've read what I thought was your bio, but if you want to say a little bit more about yourself, that would be great. You're on mute for some reason. We can't hear you.
That's okay. I think I muted myself.
Okay.
So you can't hear my hands tapping away. I think you covered it pretty well in the introduction. I have been living in Scotland for quite a long time. I was born in Nigeria, came to Scotland in the 80s, and I've been here since, lived in various parts across Scotland, both in rural places, and now I live in Glasgow, which is one of it's the biggest city in Scotland. But probably when we talk about population size, it will feel quite small compared to where a lot of people are maybe tuning in from. STUC, Scottish Trade Union Congress. So the TUC represents, just to clarify that little acronym, the TUC and the Scottish TUC represents all affiliated trade unions. So it represents around 500,000 workers in the UK. Or sorry, in Scotland. The TUC, which covers the UK, which is England and Wales mainly, represent far more workers. So
great. Yeah. Thank you for that explanation. I didn't know, but I appreciate it. Well, let's get into it. As people are joining us on different platforms, we want to tell you to share this broadcast. And we know people will be watching afterwards as well, but we really enjoy like live conversations and live chats. So share this program if you're watching on Burning Spirit TV, on YouTube, if you're watching on AMWO's pages, on Facebook, and on YouTube. So I just wanted to thank Layla-Roxanne for joining us today. And, we got questions, and I'm about to share our questions with you. The first one is, how do you identify? African, Black, Scot, mixed race, woman, human, etc.? Does this and whatever you are, however you identify, does this identity hinder or contribute to your outlook of the world?
Yeah. So I identify as Black, African, and Scottish woman and human. Um, I think it's important, which we might come across later on for our discussion, that it's important to say Black African, particularly in Scotland, because the ways in which Black is used is interchangeable.
Mm,
And it's not specific to Black African people. I also identify as mixed race because I think it's important for people to know that my experience isn't similar. Neither is my knowledge to people who are not mixed race. It's very different to people of African descent who also don't identify as Scottish. And I think Scottishness, again, quite important, which kind of also I'm conflicted about all these identifications
right.
because I think they can also be harmful as opposed to helpful.
Mm,
But compared to a Black English experience or a Black American experience or a Black European experience, it's very different. So I think it is important to state this. It's helpful and unhelpful. Because sometimes I think we can get a little bit bogged down in too many of the identifications when at the end of the day, and I think your organisation states it quite clearly and quite helpfully, we're all African.
right. Right. No, I totally understand the limitations of identity. But it has helped me, as an African woman who was born in the United States from African people who were born in the Caribbean. Really the central piece for me is African, no matter where I land. And in our organization we recognize the centrality of being an African person and how that's a political statement. So, where I used to be saying, I used to say that I was a, Jug American, a Jamaican Grenadian American sort of thing. And so this simplifies it for me, but also is just really intrinsic to, the core of, how I identify. So I appreciate your explanation, and I know that it can be quite limiting in some spaces. In some spaces, it's very helpful to really explain, all of those things. So, um, my next question for you, and I hate to like chatter it out like questions, but we're gonna have a more natural discussion as we move along. But can you give us a snapshot about the demographics of Africans in Scotland? Like what portion of the population, health statistics, if you have those? Um, what is our interactions with the law, so to speak, and labor, and however whatever you have to share, I think that will be really important. But just to give people like a snapshot of like what life is like for African people in Scotland.
So it's probably helpful to explain that Scotland is a country within the UK, quite a small country. The population is roughly 5.5 million. So it is small. From the data that we have available, it's from our last census, which is something that happens every 10 years. The most recent one was actually undertaken last year. It was supposed to be 2021, but due to COVID and government bureaucracy and the desire to move it online, there's been a delay in these stats being released. So in our book and the most recent data available to, I guess, anybody that's interested in these types of things is from 2011. And that suggests that people of African descent in Scotland make up 1% of that population. I think from looking around in Glasgow, which is the biggest city of 275,000 people. No, 500 something thousand people. You can see that that's changed dramatically. We also know that Scotland, and particularly Glasgow, had an agreement with the UK government to receive quite a lot of money to take refugees and people who were seeking asylum.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of people at that time, particularly around about 2013, were coming from different countries within Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think looking about and from being able to identify and recognise people who, you know, were African, our fellow comrades, now there's a whole host of different people, and you're also seeing like a lot of these changes in more rural areas, villages, towns, you know, not the urban centres in which where people of African descent are expected to be, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly in more rural landscapes, you're starting to see like more African people making home in those places as well. So yeah, I think, and this is something that we actually touch upon in our book, that what we've come across are people stating that the insignificance of that data set
Mm-hmm.
means that it's not worth doing any further research. It's not
Mm-hmm.
worth like changing policies to enhance or better the lives of people of African descent in Scotland, because it's this is a quote, insignificant. It's an insignificant amount of data.
Mm-hmm.
So something that we try to speak about, I guess, like in our book, is that it should be about people, not percentages. But obviously, data is helpful at times, but we can see the ways in which it's weaponized and utilized to say that it's not helpful. From the limited data that is available, because I think you've said about labour experiences with the law and health, something that has come up through the pandemic is that there has been like an increase in sort of research into the specific experiences of people of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And unsurprisingly, we're finding that it disproportionately affected Black African people, Black African women in particular, were more likely to be if they were pregnant, they were more likely to be hospitalised and become seriously unwell. More likely to die from those pregnancies, which is also building on other research. And, you know, this is something that isn't unique to Scotland.
Right.
I guess this is what we try to argue in our book, that it's structural, it's global, you know, anti-Blackness is a global thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're starting to see the same sort of effects of that in Scotland. We're also finding, you know, there was some other research which showed that people of African descent were more likely to lose their jobs, you know, again, falling into precarious workplaces during the pandemic, not as likely to have access to savings, having to rely on, you know, family, friends, losing homes. So again, just to say, as we all know, it's structural, it's not individual. Scotland's not a unique place, despite a narrative that we do have and promote, that Scotland, you know, is very welcoming, that anyone can become Scottish, and you know we're all tam. There's a famous quote that they use, and it's like we're all the same in Scotland.
Okay.
And when you move here, particularly as a refugee or a migrant, you know, refugees are welcome here. It's a big slogan that's used in Scotland. But we argue quite cynically that it's a marketing strategy, because when it comes down to it, the reality is we're experiencing the same things as Black Africans in Scotland as you would in other parts of the world. So also in terms of law and our encounters with the legal service, there's some, again, very small bits of data that are starting to come through, that people of African descent and or of mixed origin, which is why I think it's important to identify as mixed race in this case, are more likely to be incarcerated, despite the small population starting to make up the percentages of the prisons in Scotland.
Wow.
Disproportionately. So again, mimicking things that we're seeing in England and Wales and elsewhere in the world, and also more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And I guess just to say that it's African women who are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act here. and
I'm
I
gonna
mean,
wait till you're done because I have so much to add to what you're saying. But go ahead, please.
and also more likely to be seen as a threat to society as opposed to other ethnic groups. I guess we should also say that Scotland has two high-profile deaths of people of African descent at the hands of the police. One is Sheku Bayo, who is a man originally from Sierra Leone, had been living in Scotland for quite some time. And in 2015, after encountering police, 6 to 7 police officers, within 45 seconds, he was restrained, leg shackled, face down on the ground, and experienced quite a lot of violence and died. There's currently a public inquiry into his death at the moment, which has obviously been a very, very long time, as you can imagine, for his family as well. It's been an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2021, an asylum seeker called Badrahin Abdullah Adam was shot dead by Police Scotland following a mental health crisis at a hotel in which he'd been more or less incarcerated in. And I think that was the first shooting by Police Scotland since the 60s.
Wow.
So that's two very high-profile deaths of men of Black African descent, and I think there's supposed to be an inquiry into his death as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in terms of Labour, like, I don't know if you want me to go on or if you want to interrupt me now and ask me some questions.
I do. Because I think all of the things that you just said are really important. Number one, I think when Europe is sold to the world as, particularly for African people, as a place where it's welcoming for, it's not the same Jim Crow-ish sort of stuff that the United States experienced. What we learned, as members of this movement, is that it doesn't matter where you are. You can drop an African in the middle of anywhere. They can be 0.2% of the population. They'll be that 0.2% that's in prison, that experiences disparities and all the things that you just said. So I think it's really important for us to really get that understanding that, this, how we understand it is colonialism, right? Like, so colonialism is the key center point question for us, and why African people experience the way that it is, why systems are created in the way that it is, because it was created because of colonialism. And so when you also talked about the infant and maternal death rate for African moms, I mean, this is something that is all over the world, maybe except for Cuba, where mothers have a higher percentage um, of experiencing death or some other complication due to pregnancy, despite having some of access to some of the best healthcare in some instances, or maybe even being of a higher tax bracket or income bracket. They still can experience um, of this. So I just wanted to tag in and say that what you're saying is not something that we haven't heard before, but I think it's really important for people who watch us, who see, um, can hear from you, can really experience Europe is not different from anywhere else on the face of the planet, and African people certainly do not coast through. I am interested in learning about in the many ways that African people come to Glasgow. Is there hundreds of years of Black people in not Glasgow, but in Scotland? Um, has there been generations there, or has most of the population come there through immigration, migrancy? Yeah.
So the the earliest documentation of somebody of African descent in Scotland, I think, is from the 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with data documentation, how much that helps and how much that hinders, it's patchy at best. And when we think about the people who have access and control to archives and documentation and data, and obviously the racist connotations of that as well. So it is quite patchy, I think, and we don't have as strong a history or sense of who has been where and when. as you might actually find like in England, for example, like where, particularly like with the Windrush generation, there's a lot of access to the history.
Mm-hmm.
And having conversations with some of our elders here, that's some of the folks who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s now, and it's like you hear, well, actually, like my families have been here, my family have been here for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book by some Belizean forestry workers from the 1940s time period who were documenting like their lives here in Scotland and the work that they were doing. So I guess it's like we definitely see things like more recently, and we know that Scotland was as complicit, if not more so, in the transatlantic slave
Of
trade.
course. Yeah.
So there are records of African people being in Scotland, passing through, sometimes running away in Scotland, and we don't know, where these people went.
Right.
Did they stay in Scotland? Did they go elsewhere? But there's definitely a long and strong history of Africans in Scotland. More recently, I think touched upon that there's definitely been more people of African descent coming via immigration, migration, also in terms of educational opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
which, again, that's also something that's not relatively new. But if we're looking at some of the nations in Africa that are recognising the benefit of a British education, and Scotland, is considered to have some of the oldest universities, which that's a different conversation, for sure, completely different conversation. But there seems to be an elite, University of Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Glasgow University are considered elite universities, some of the oldest in the UK, some of the oldest in Europe. So a lot of our brothers and sisters in Africa want to send, their children there to study. And I don't know how much they engage with Africans who are then like, living and building a life here. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of like community engagement, for want of a better word. It's like to study and then we go back and, or we move on somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a mishmash, I guess, just like anywhere is. But definitely over the past 10, 20 years, it's been from the UK's imperialist projects and endeavours across the rest of the world,
Yeah.
and people having to leave their homes and find a home here. I think touched upon as well that Scotland's been incentivised to receive people, so there is quite a big refugee industry here, which
Talk about that a little bit more. When you
yeah,
industry, you call it an industry.
industries and institutions. So yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? Like, why'd you call it an industry? Because for us, like, we don't have refugee centers per se in the U.S. So, like, can you say what it means to call it an industry, and what does it look like?
So Glasgow, for example, in 2012, 2013, was given quite a lot of money from the UK government and the Scottish government to take in refugees. Instead of like building support and infrastructure, what happened in that case, they were placed in some of the poorest areas in Glasgow. There's quite a few, I guess, social history and social documentation of the experiences of people that were put there, who many of which couldn't speak English, put into incredibly deprived areas in Glasgow where the population of some white folks, your life expectancy is mid-40s. Yeah, this is, again, it's interesting because it's part of the ongoing process of capitalism, and you see how it impacts, white folks here. And so then there became like the opportunity for so-called NGOs, charitable organizations, well-meaning, people,
Well-meaning. That's
which again, it's the same everywhere, right?
right.
Well-meaning individuals and institutions who then, as opposed to providing people with the skills and the opportunities to live their full lives, outside of being a refugee,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes very much an institutionalization process,
Right.
and it is an industry, and then it goes hand in hand with the narrative that we have of people being welcome here.
Mm-hmm.
But we have detention centres, like
Yeah.
here in the detention centre where we still detain people. We're now detaining people in hotels, but that's seen as more humane. But again, this is happening in areas across Scotland, where there's not been a great deal of public investment. There's already, tensions because people are feeling that their communities haven't been funded or supported.
Right.
So it immediately creates conflict. And the people who have been housed in these places then become reliant on the states, the church, and the well-meaning NGOs and various other organisations, as opposed to dual power, right? Challenge institutions, but also understand that you need to build like your own power and not be so dependent. But when you're put into a situation where you feel that you might be deported at any given time, then you kind of have to toe the line, right? That you can't speak out against the the obscene like reality of it.
Right.
That people don't have access to foodstuffs, that they enjoy, that there's very limited interaction like with the broader community, and that people are getting lots of money. Whereas the folks that have come here, are expected to live on virtually nothing. So
Yeah.
this is why it's called an industry. Controversial, because there is such a strong narrative of people welcoming refugees and the reaction that, yeah, so it becomes a funny place to be in, because you can't, or you feel that you can't challenge like these narratives.
Yeah.
Well, look at what we're doing here. It's like we're housing people, we're providing this.
I as you talk, I'm just like, first of all, NGOism is trash. Like it's trash. It's absolute trash. Like it really is. You get all this resources to fund your NGO so that you can be in these places and treat the symptoms of the problem, but the problem never goes away. And so we see that, as you're explaining it, in a place like Scotland, like we've seen it in places like Haiti and throughout Africa and different places around the world where, people there has been hundreds, if not thousands of NGOs on the ground in these places in different, at any given time, probably for decades. But the thing that they're saying that they're trying to solve and help for never really gets solved. So I can see how that is definitely like funneling money in and then trickling whatever out to people who are supposed to get it. So I totally understand.
They
Um,
have, they have no desire to solve the problem.
no,
The problem's best kept as a problem. And as you said, it generates income, it
mm-hmm.
generates social capital for
Right,
well-meaning people and organisations, which it becomes the same types of people that you see that are at the helm, which, yeah, opportunists and people that, it becomes very difficult to challenge, like their anti-blackness, their
mm-hmm.
class politics when they're doing good things.
Right.
And also, I forgot to actually say when you're saying about the population, Scotland also had a big Scottish missionary history.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a funny wee place, and it is one of the seats of empire, and that history hasn't really gone away. So there's still a lot of Scottish missionaries that go over to Africa. I think Scotland's very proud of like its missionary history and how helped to bring enlightenment to the people of Africa. There's still a lot of ongoing work in Malawi by organisations in Scotland. And also, I think just to say that Police Scotland are wonderful um, police force. They also do work to address gender-based violence in African countries and get funded by the Scottish Government to teach people how to address gender-based violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember what the other part of it is, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
two-pronged thing. So yeah.
I do want to say that gender-based violence as a precondition for NGOs and other sorts of military actions in Africa and other places around the world is really key. Like they use women, even though women are experiencing violence, but the violence never goes away because the conditions under which the violence is predicated, it never goes away. So there's always like this inference and focus on they're killing the women, they're killing the children. So we got to go in and fund whatever military occupation or whatever sort of NGO or missionary or whatever it is to save these people. But to save these people, you actually have to stop robbing those countries and taking the resources and creating and undermining economies and social life so that people can actually live without fear and violence. And so I just wanted to say that as you were mentioning, like the whole gender based thing, like we see that all the time that they use. When I say they, imperialists use gender based violence, capitalists use gender based violence as a way to infiltrate, African communities and really destroy any fabric of self determination. Um, there is a lot of what I've heard you talk about. I've looked at some videos of yours online. Has been about black being visible, and what does it mean to be visible as a black Scottish person. You mentioned your book Black Out There, and how you've raised certain issues in it. Can you talk more about the book and then why is it so important for you to for this visibility question? Some of which you've already mentioned, but let's talk about it a little bit more.
I've just remembered it was child protection and supporting governance is
Uh,
what Scotland
okay.
are also doing in Malawi
You
and
said
Zambia.
child protection.
Yes.
I'm gonna double back to that. I'm gonna write that down so I don't forget. Okay.
I mean, it's good to be able to laugh at these
I
things, but also
mean, it,
not
it,
laugh.
it shows us that there is nothing new under the sun, that the strategies that they employ, because that's one of our major campaigns is like child protection and fighting the family regulation system here in the US and how it represents itself even in Europe, because we had a few cases in there as well, but how it represents itself in Africa and other places, and how they say that they're protecting us from ourselves when in fact it is them who have created the violence and the conditions under which children and women are being harmed. Um, so I'm glad you offered that and you remembered that because I just wanted to. That's a really good point.
But
But yeah,
it's
let's talk about your book, Black Out There, and why is it so important for Black visibility, African visibility in Scotland? Because for me, I'm a, I'm like an anti everything. I'm like F Scotland, right? Like so I'm like, yeah, Scotland. You don't need to be there anyway. You know what I'm saying? So I'm an anti, but yeah, and so part of that makes me cringe in terms of visibility aspect of being visible in Scotland. F Scotland, Scotland needs to go away. But recognizing that there is a 1% there, and that there is something that needs to we have to improve conditions for African people and fight for them wherever we are. So I really love to hear your insight and go into depth about the visibility aspect and how it represents stuff in your book.
I mean, I agree as well. Like F Scotland, like
Yes.
but I do believe that yeah, just like what we're saying, it has a key role in imperialism, the British Empire,
Mm-hmm.
and colonialism, both historically and now. So as much as yeah, I want to say forget about it. I'm also conscious that you need to understand it and you need to understand thine enemy. Um, so our book, so my co-author is Francesca Subandi. She is a lecturer at Cardiff University, but she had been born in Scotland, and she's also a black mixed race woman, and had spent most of her life here. We met, I think we say the story's very dull. We met at a very dull NGO event, and started doing some work together, including um, founding a Black African women-led collective in 2016. Everybody was on a different political journey at that time.
That is how it be sometimes. You're like,
So people went their different ways, and I think it's still in existence in a way that we wouldn't have imagined it to be. But hey, it did a thing, and that was really like to that we were particularly interested, like Francesca and I's like interests are in Black women of African descent. We were conscious that a lot of work that in research and books that are about Black people in Scotland tend to focus on the transatlantic slave trade, that it didn't really centre the lives of Black people in Scotland. That there just wasn't a great deal. I mean, our work draws upon a PhD that was completed by a woman called June Evans, that looked at the lives of people of African and Caribbean descent in Scotland in the 90s, and a lot of the things that she was saying then are still relevant now, if not more pronounced, I guess. So, yeah, I guess we wanted to do something that would hopefully contribute to a canon. We wanted to make sure. I mean, it's not our book, it's everybody's book. It has surveys from people. It has some in-depth interviews, photographs by a really talented African woman photographer, Najma Abikar. And we've just recently completed a comic and an animation, just to broaden and widen access. And we know we do speak about this, like the idea of borders and the idea of like nationality and nationalism has its own difficulties as well. But I think one of the things that we have been seeing, and historically, is that the Black British experience is one that's very much the Black London sort of Black English experience, and doesn't really like speak to the nuances that with some of which that we've covered. What it means to be one Black person living in a village or a town of 20,000 people.
right.
What impact does that have? Who can you turn to? Who do you find community with? How are you able to just be? So we do think it is important to speak specifically about the visibility of Black African people. I think mentioned at the start as well that Scotland has a tendency, and also in its organising spaces, to use politically Black. So that covers any racialised person. So the stats, the data that exists, the very little data that exists, ends up becoming just clumped into like one group. And I think it's important for the nuances to really be teased out, because at the end of the day, it's like the experiences of someone, again, we see the benefits of organising, collectively as racialised people, but we also need to understand the nuances of people of African descent. So, yeah, I think I've now lost my wee train of thought. So feel free to interrupt me now.
So you talk about Black African, and for us, African means every Black person on the face of the planet. So in Scotland, is there like in, for example, England, where they separate African from the Caribbean from wherever else? Is that the same sort of demarcation that they do in Scotland, or is African talking about just continentals, Africans that come from the continent directly, immediately?
There's no universal answer, I guess.
Okay.
Each organization, each institution will use like their own data marking.
Mm.
There are groups, some grassroots groups that are, in existence, and some of those will say African, some of those will say specifically, Somalian,
Mm-hmm.
specifically Scottish Kenyans.
Uh,
Um,
it's like the weirdest. Like even like the weirdest. Okay.
Even when we were asking, I guess people in our book, that was one of the key questions that we asked. It's like how do you identify? And there was a whole host. It was like
Mm.
Black, Scottish, African, Nigerian, or Black, British, Scottish,
Mm.
or Somalian, British. There was all different types of identification, I guess, within the trade union movement. I know that it's again, it's politically black that's used, which covers all non-white people. And if it comes to like answering questions, you can then be specific
Mm.
what you identify as. But I'd say like a lot of the sort of local and national government stuff, it'll be black minority ethnic,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just
Oh, okay.
Bane.
Is there a black community? Like, 'cause everywhere got a black community, right? Like, it's that one place where black people just be, and you got black stuff happening and all that. Is there like a black community? And I know you're in Glasgow, so like, is there one there?
So there used to be a African Caribbean Centre that closed down. There there was an African Arts Centre, and that's closed down.
Okay.
Um, there's some, so I guess, like in terms of physical spaces, apart from, I know that there's some black-owned churches in Glasgow.
Mm.
So there's community there for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous restaurant called Calabash in Glasgow, and that's where everybody, goes. They have some food and then they just dance, and watch a football and drink Nigerian beer.
I guess I'm asking this question. I'm sorry to cut you off. I guess I'm asking this question, which is, I think, is your response is really telling, because it's not like it's the same everywhere, but really just there can be a delineation between Africans depending on where they come from, their own cultural experiences and how they identify, especially when they come to a new place. And but I also know that these all the identities that you've mentioned, which is Scottish Kenyans. For some reason, I have this visual in my mind of like, because it's not the Scots that wear kilts, right? Is okay, like a African in this kilt with bagpipes. It's just crazy, but like,
I mean, that's also probably, yeah, quite true.
but yeah, the assimilation is aspect of it, like the part where you were saying that we trying to like Scotland and convey to the world that it is a place where people can come and become Scottish. But part of that is erasing or limiting your Africanness or diminishing that and making that invisible. As much as you can become more Scottish, you can be more accepted. I'm not sure if that's, I don't think that's totally exception, but like you can hang with the folks if you don't bring up your African. If you could drink a beer, blow in the bagpipe, dance the Scottish jig and whatever else there is, then you're a-okay. But that's part of the process of like really breaking down the African national identity, because even though we're in different places around the world, like there still is a sense of sameness. I don't care if we live like like hey girl, it doesn't matter that I have an accent, you have an accent. you know when it comes to police killing of folks, and that's a horrible way to come together, everybody's upset, no matter where they are. And we want to do something to change those conditions because there's that sense of sameness, that connectedness that holds us all together. And what I feel based on your responses is that, not only in Scotland, but here and places, other places, is that this work to kind of break down that connective fiber that we all feel intuitively and we all see it through our responses to things to kind of make us something other than what we are. And the more that we do that, whether it's based on gratefulness for being taken in as a refugee or immigrant or some other kind of sense of allegiance or national or patriotism to the country in which you land, we kind of we're okay with that and forget that there's the reason that you're there is the reason that we're here is because of something had been done to us, something had been done to the place that we've come from, um, and we have to claim that, we have to own that. But yeah, I think that is really important. That whole question of national identity and being, I this is stuck in my mind, like being a Scottish Kenyan or whatever else.
I think it's
Um,
worth. I think it's also worth saying that one of the Scottish government's big sort of policies was an idea called New Scots.
oh,
Um,
I already know what this. I know where this is going. But go ahead.
so yeah, you kind of you know what it is, and it's just like if you're not born here, if you don't look as if you're an Indigenous person that's white, then you're a New Scot. And as long as you integrate, don't challenge the narrative that there's institutional or structural issues. I guess it's conservatism slash Toryism light. Just pull up your socks and work hard, and you will eventually get to like where everybody else is, and forget about the other stuff. And I think that's also quite important, like in the refugees are welcome here narrative as well, because there's a sort of, so that's you, like you're a refugee, and then you're just completely integrated and assimilated into society, Scottish society, which isn't true. In most cases, you are then a Black African person in Scotland, and given that there hasn't been a lot of work done, like either in a policy level, we've already seen that it's like the same structural stuff is happening like here as well, and there's no great challenge like to it.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's it makes people feel better because like Scotland is seen as like not being as racist as England. It's not as bad as America. Like that's the narrative in which it tells itself and the people tell itself.
That's what
Then
we hear. That not just Scotland, but like Europe as a whole is better than the U.S. So Africans need to go there, as
yeah.
opposed to like burning down the whole thing, in which all of these places get the resources that they get from us.
So I do feel like what you're saying is like to then proudly say that you're African when you're just too busy trying to get on with and not challenging like the narrative which is all around you by individuals, institutions, and industries. Um, I think we do lose a sense of our Africanness and our African identity, and that at the end of the day, like we all come from the same place and we're all Africa's children.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Um, we're gonna get into like the anti-capitalist part of it now because we are an anti-colonial revolutionary women's organization that wants to participate in the burning down, the overturning, destruction of colonialism to right the world, right? To bring it to right side up. And you identify as an anti-capitalist, and you are an activist and an author and a writer. Can you just talk a little bit more about how being an anti-capitalist in Scotland, one of the seats of imperialism, right? Well, how does that? What kinds of things are you challenging in your work? But beyond that, like what kind of things need to be challenged in Scotland from that perspective? Yeah, that's my question.
So Scotland. does have like a strong socialist tradition,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly in Glasgow. So that hasn't really gone away. I'd say, and there's a lot of people who are still strong socialists. I'd say that a lot of the organisations have maybe fallen away due to the various things that we've already covered. In terms of direction, ideology, and political aspects. And I think as well that one of the failures of socialist organisations in Glasgow and Scotland has not been more welcoming of people of African descent. And there's one of the interviewees in our book, in fact, speaks about how he's involved with Scottish CND, which is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, because we have a huge nuclear base like here, and there's a strong campaign organisation that's been around for a long time. And he talks about how he ends up doing all the printing of leaflets. He ends up getting put aside to do all the administrative work. But also, like, when he tried to bring some literature, from Malcolm X, Harold Cruz, they were just like, that's not relevant here. It doesn't matter, like, here. And he's like, it's an internationalist thing. And I think that's maybe one of the things that I struggle with, especially in the trade union movement, that we've both got this idea that we don't want nuclear weapons in Scotland, but we're happy to build them because Scottish jobs for Scottish workers, and we're happy for those to be used elsewhere. And it's just like, so where's the internationalism in it? Whereas like your anti-capitalism, because then when it comes down to it, it's just jobs, and there's not a real question of, or not even a real desire to create jobs that aren't going to cause harm to both people here, to the people that work in those jobs, but just elsewhere, like in the world. And I think we've lost a sense of our internationalism. We've lost a sense of our globalism. Don't know if that's to do with our like Scottish independence referendum, where people have ended up being so, caught up in Scottishness, and then we've had Brexit as part of the UK. So I guess in my own work is trying to provide ways and opportunities for people just to offer a little bit of care, a little bit of imagination, think about doing and being and living in ways that aren't reliant like on a capitalist system. And it is hard to do in this place. Everybody is so dependent, and combined with all the narratives that we've covered like earlier in this conversation. But there's a couple of good folks, and I think it's just again like trying to draw individuals to have a stronger organisation and unifying under like a greater sense. So I think yeah, it's just chipping away. I'm fortunate I get to write and just try and put some writing out there. I'm also fortunate I get asked to come and speak at things, and I know that isn't the be all and end all. But I am working with a group at the moment, and we're hoping to sort of help people understand like the economy and like what economics means, and how we can maybe like shift our deeply wedded beliefs in a capitalist system to something that's more full of care. And I'm also hoping next year to start a Black radical education, political education program, because I think that's what we're lacking. We've got a strong trade union movement here, but the political education movement isn't strong. And I think that's the key. It's like you look at people in places across the world, and it's like if you've got political education, like that's that's when you get people, and people love learning. And I think there's been an intention to sort of prevent people from accessing ways to learn, ways to get educated in non-institutional ways. So I'm hoping in January to gather up some Black Africans in Scotland, and particularly working class, because I think there has been a tendency here to sort of invite and uphold the Black middle class,
Hmm.
um, who
We
purport.
call them the Black petty bourgeoisie, right? Like, so the Black middle class who always abandons the interests of the African masses for their own because that's because they're getting held up. I'm sorry to cut you off,
No, no, no.
but I think what you were saying about workers, Scottish workers, and how they're happy to get jobs and work at the expense of like a fair and equal world. So this really is like what our chairman Amalia Chatella, has been saying, is that there is like the labor, the the uplift, or the fact that more people in Europe got jobs was because they were raping Africa and getting the resource out of Africa and processing those. So they can never be like the workers of the world unite, because the workers of the Euro world would not unite if the Africans who were resisting colonial occupation in their countries were saying, no, you can't have access to any of this, and it would be a contention. So really, it does need African workers to be a part of these discussions, but more importantly, to lead them, because that opens up the world view of those who are who consider themselves socialists, because you're really not. I mean, socialism that's based on capitalism, which is like you're a socialist only because capitalism exists. Could you be a socialist? And are you a real socialist if you're not really trying to destroy capitalism and the means of production that will rob the resources and labor of other people so that you can have a job? And that's the reality of it. And I think that what you're saying in terms of political education is really key to that, not only just for African people, but for everybody there. I'm not saying you're responsible to teach white folks how to be not white, but but like really, helping African people recognize like your power and your significance in this place, that you do not have to shirk and be shy or not be able to put forth your perspective of the world because you're 1% of the population. And and so I'm getting now like what you were talking about in terms of visibility and being able to, like, the visible part of the black folks is probably not going to be like the nice part for this, it will be like the militant revolutionaries who want to transform society so that it could be equitable and fair. And for a lot of white people, being equitable and fair means attacking what they currently have and what they sit upon, which is the pedestal of colonialism that allows them to have a Glasgow University and all the wealth and things that they currently experience right now. And so I appreciate you saying that, because I was just like, whoa, like, this is real time. We have a lot of labor organizations around the world, in Europe and US in particular. And I think this question gets missed a lot. The question of workers and why are you fighting for this job, and what what does it impact? Like, you should be a worker in a nuclear factory and you should shut it down. You shouldn't even you say, I'm not working here, because we don't want these bombs to be anywhere in the world. And I think that just really looking at the whole question of socialism and what it means, particularly in Scotland and anywhere else, it means that African workers and people who have been colonized have to lead all of that. So, because whatever happens in Europe impacts
Mm.
us in the so-called third world, right? Like the colonized places around the world where these things, where you don't have roads, you don't have electricity. And we were seeing what's happening in Niger right now, where there's like France can't get in, and France is like, oh no, you power all of our lights, or 20% of our lights, and we need you to be democratic. And U.S. is like, you need to be democratic, and the workers in France, are they uniting with the struggle of people in Niger to be self-determined and not have it, their access, like, yeah, shut the lights down, because these people need to be free of France's colonial grip. And, workers should be in the streets in France uniting with the struggle, as opposed to trying to pressure the people in Niger to, um, to, you know, give out. And I'm on a rant, but like, really just trying to link what you're just saying in terms of like the whole question of workers and socialism and how it really plays out in real time in real life, and how African workers and other colonized people who are workers don't really aren't really leading it. Maybe here some people are leading it, but what it sounds like in Scotland that they're not leading it and are often xed out and reduced to being workers inside of a workers' party as opposed to leaders inside that party. And so we will want to help you do political education if you are open to it. We can organize one. We can come up with a curricula. We're down for that. And let me see. Oh, okay. So it was an old video, but I did see something where I am paraphrasing because I was trying to find the exact spot. It said it, then it ran on, and then I was like, I have to go back to that, but I don't remember the time frame in which it was said. And you can correct me if I get it wrong. But I watched a video in which you thought that continuing to relate colonialism to the conditions of Black people in Scotland was limiting. I don't know if you still feel that way. I think that video was like 5 years ago. And if you do, like, can you explain why you think that way?
So I think I know the video that you're talking about. Was I wearing like quite a funky shirt?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have a thing for funky shirts. I think it maybe draws back on what we'd spoken about earlier, that it's only been in recent years that Scotland started to reckon like with its transatlantic slave trade history. And I feel like the ways in which that's being done, like now, and when the conversation started happening, it shines the light away from the material conditions of Black African people in Scotland right now, which we've spoken about. It's the same, it's a global occurrence. What's happening here, we're more likely to die, and this is in a country that has free National Health Service, right?
Mm.
We're still dying. Also in Scotland, we have free prescriptions, which means you don't have to pay for your medication,
Mm.
but we're still dying at a disproportionate rate. We're still being incarcerated at a disproportionate rate. We're still not doing well in school at a disproportionate rate. So if we live in a country that, is supposed to have like access to all these things, then why is that still happening like now? And I think like when we look and focus on the transatlantic slave trade, it just becomes another research area for people,
Right.
and to show, oh, this is what happens now, and what we'll do now is like the University of Glasgow will offer a 1-year scholarship to African students, to study at the University of Glasgow. So I think there's a space for everything, like here and in the work that we do. But I guess like where I've grown like over the past couple of years is that I want to improve our lot like right now. That there's already been a ton of research on the transatlantic slave trade,
Right.
um, in relation to here, and it's dominated by a couple of Scottish historians as well. And I'm more, just concerned about what we can do about the here and now, how we can build, how we can build a global African movement, and how we can be more internationalist, and how we can provide people with opportunities to dream, and experience joy beyond conversations that then only focus like on experiences of racism, because that's all that happens here, or extra training. So I guess like maybe I still have like leanings towards that, but it's perhaps like more developed. Also, I can't even remember who was asking me the questions, but I probably felt quite under the spot, as I always do in these things. But yeah, I don't know if that answers.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the way that I always say I think a lot, I need to get rid of that. But like, colonialism for us, in the Uhuru movement is not something that's stagnant and still that was happened 500 years, 40 years. It's something that's currently happening. identify ourselves, those of us who live in the United States, is that we're domestically colonized within the U.S. colony because the United States itself is a colony. It was taken from indigenous people. African people were brought here. So colonialism is something that is real, it's fresh, we smell it, we breathe it every day, and that's primarily how we view the world. We don't even know what it means not to be colonized. We've never experienced generations and generations alive, never experienced freedom and life, or can even dream anything beyond trying to be equal to white people. And a lot of that's why I'm like so anti, like I'm anti in general, but like I'm anti equality, because who are we trying to be equal to? Because we always measure ourselves like we need to be like the white people who killed us, the white people who kidnapped us, the white people who steal from us. Like I don't want to be equal to that. I want to be better than that. And so colonialism is like really destroying those boundaries that keep us trapped in this dichotomy of where we trying to be like the people who are oppressing us, but we have to recognize our own significance as human beings in this world who deserve to be free and deserve everything, just like everybody deserves everything. Like we need to have good roads, we need to have food, we need to have electricity, we need to be able to thrive and reproduce for ourselves. And currently, even if we move out of Africa and move to different places, we still can't even do that because based on the numbers that you just shared from Scotland, numbers that I could probably rattle off for the United States and other places, and even places that are predominantly African, we do not fare well anywhere. And that's not because we don't work hard. It's not because we don't contribute to society. It's not because of any of that. It's because colonialism is still intact and the same structures that that um, have been in place still are in place because we didn't destroy that. So everything that we consider success or progress means achieving a place in society that is equal to white people, as opposed to saying we have to destroy the pedestal upon which white people sit and get all their resources. So really just looking at like anti-colonialism as something that's not based on some far away or past thing, but that's something that's currently right now is really key for us. And in terms of like the internationality of a movement, um, just really being able to connect with you and whatever organizations that maybe they're on the ground and like really helping to build that. Because like with any organization, like we struggle, there are struggles that happen, like people, I don't think that way. And because when you were mentioning the women's group that you were that you were a part of creating, I was like, oh, I already know what the struggles of that. Like people have different political lines. You don't think the same way. It's like I'm just trying to get us to the place where we can actually, and it becomes really difficult. So really, helping people understand like the center point question on that is really, really important, so that we can have a singular theory, a singular way. And for us as African internationalism, we hope that every African on the face of the planet can learn African internationalism and as a theory and apply it, and build. So I think that it's possible in whatever capacity that we are able to participate and help and do whatever we can. I think it's really possible to really get Africans to the place where we can see like the scope of our world, but also our significance in it. So as we are winding down, we're going to have a place for questions and answers. But before we do that, I have one more question before we go into the questions that may be coming from the chat. Because we were just talking about the world and what we see for ourselves, and what kind of world is a double. It's a lot of questions in one. But what kind of world are you working toward? What do you hope will be the reality for African people in say 10, 50, or 100 years, whether it be in Scotland or elsewhere in the face of the planet?
Oh, I guess, when I think about how much like our lives are shaped and experienced by trauma and hardship, and how that then sort of gets fetishized, upon. I think it would just be nice, like for just be nice. It would just be like nice for people to, for us, just to be able to live. in however way that we want to live, free of humiliation, free of state-enforced trauma, free to be able to access fresh air, fresh water, greenery, just life, free to access life. Freedom to just be and, experience care. I feel like it's such a small thing, or these are like generally these are such small things to ask for. Like when you think about it, when you think about how abundant like our earth is, when you think of how abundant our continent Africa is, and it's so inaccessible to many of us. So I guess that's a world that I'm working towards, but also one that's accountable, one that's honest. Oh, is it just me?
No, just give me 1 second. Go ahead, please continue.
Okay. And just, yeah, I think just one that has like accountability and transparency and honesty. If everybody is able to live like their fullest lives as their full selves, people feel less insecure. It's like they feel less angry, they feel less unsupported. And I just think that that's just like where we need to be, and that involves all of us, right? 5 years. I don't know how things are going to be in 5 months, with the way of the world at the moment. I guess just all the things that I said that I was maybe working towards. I hope that we are in a much stronger place, because we have seen a growth in like global blackness. If we look at our Beyonces and things, and that makes it very difficult. A whole thing on that as well.
Right.
And that makes, I guess, just what we were speaking about before, it makes it very difficult to like challenge like a narrative, because it's all aspirational. It's like, well, look at me, like in the Louvre, you can be here too. And it's just like, well, no, it's like you are actually like a billionaire.
Yeah.
At the cost of, and you are. And I just hope that it's like we have that understanding, and that we don't uphold people that we see are like us, but when they're actually upholding like a really harmful system that's harming the majority of us. So yeah, I would like maybe to see your organisation have grown in strength and power, and to really get us to where we are. That in 50 years' time, if humanity's still here in 50 years' time, yeah, 5 years' time, I just hope that we're ready to fight, and keep fighting, and that we're not just losing more people, and just that we're given opportunities to grieve, that we're given opportunities to think and just be.
I appreciate that. I mean, we have the same vision. We just want to live, but we also know that the people who have imperialism, like who has robbed us of so much, if we were to get control over the things, because we have to, if we just want regular stuff, if we just want clean air, if we just want clean water, um, roads, lights, access to food, um, there's something, is it a whole system that has prevented us from getting these things for so long, that we know that there will be a fight, right? Like, and there needs to be a preparation for, I think in people's minds, we have to get that through. I'm not saying we're going to be ready to fight in 5 years. I hope we are, but like, because the world has changed so much, even in 2000 and what was it, 14, with the murder of Mike Brown, like people, and that after that, like it transformed. Like we went from like slow snail pace to like rapid political education. So we know that with every single opportunity, I won't say opportunity, but every single tragic case that we are afforded an opportunity to learn and do different. And I do hope that in 5 years, in less than 5 years, we will be ready to fight, and that we will take back what's ours and be able to accumulate the things that we need to accumulate to make sure that our people are safe and defended and protected. Um, so we're going to pause. We're going to have some questions and answers in the next segment. And I'm just going to bring forward Coco, who's going to share some announcements, and then we can get back to the Q&A. Who are Coco?
Uhuru, that was I really enjoyed this discussion. And I'm still waiting for my book to come in the mail. So we are on our way to the question and answer section. But before that, they have some annual announcements. So starting with our joint animal. And like, if you enjoyed this discussion or interested in learning more, or just a woman that's seeking out some type of revolutionary leadership, AMWO is the only anti-colonial, anti-imperialist organization for Black women. Visit amwouhuru.org to join. Also, we are working on the annual headquarters in St. Louis. Is our doors up there, our banners up there, our flag is up there. We're representing. We already have the building. We just need help, financial donations. You can visit us on Cash App at $AMWOHURU, or you could donate from the AMWO website at amwouhuru.org/donate. You could also use your phone at this time to scan the QR code to contribute that way. Our goal is $50,000. We're well on our way, and that's just our starting goal. We know that to provide the programs that we want to provide and the services that we want to provide, we're going to need more than 50,000, but that's our start. Uhuru. So also, as the AMWO Economic Development Project is Decolonize, is a anti-imperial, anti-colonial hair and body brand. Visit decolonize.com if you're interested in buying. We also have a distributor program, so we're always looking to have people join us with Decolonize. You can actually volunteer on our committee. You can join our marketing committee, or you can actually purchase from our website. Support the Uhuru 3. We're still in this fight. Hands off Uhuru, hands off Africa. Contribute to the Legal Defense Fund to stop the FBI's legal lynching of the African People's Socialist Party Chairman Omali Yeshitela, and also our comrades with African People's Solidarity Committee as well, with Jesse Neville and Chairwoman Penny Hess. Uhuru. All right. And what we are always building, always developing. So, if you are have some skills or want to learn new skills, volunteer with us. We're looking for producers, interpreters, chat moderators, advocates for our campaigns, such as the Uhuru Kijiji Collective and Arrest CPS. And you can visit amwouhuru.org, of course, to participate, to sign up. So this month we have AMWO has 2 virtual events this month. The next one is going to be this upcoming Friday. It's going to be our political education which is entitled African Women Must Lead, with our president, Yejide Oromila. This month's subject is Colonial Capitalism, Not Patriarchy, is a Cause of Women's Oppression. And also our Harriet's Daughter Study Group and Book Club. Our new revamped book club is going to have our first virtual study session this upcoming August 27th. It's going to be, you can go to ngoism.org/events to register for this event. And we're going to be discussing Homegoing by Ya Gyasi, part one of that book. Also, Rest CPS, the campaign of AMWO, are having our National Day of Action. We have 10 cities. I added Cleveland in there because we're going to be out there too. This August 26, 2023, we're going to be in 10 cities. We're going to be standing up for African people children have been kidnapped by the state, and bringing those kids home. We have Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., San Diego, Newark, New Jersey, St. Louis, Missouri, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Durham, North Carolina, Battle Creek, Michigan, Portland, Oregon, and Cleveland, Ohio at the Etna B. Hunter Building. We're going to be there. And last but definitely not least, the new book by Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party. As book was released this month, or last month, I'm so sorry, in July. It's August already. Ordered today, that is entitled "The Verdict is In, Reparations Now," and this is celebrating the 40th anniversary edition of the report from 1982 World Tribunal on Reparations to African People. You can order at the BernieSpear.store. And that's it for our announcements. And so we're going to move into the question and answer portion. I've seen a couple questions come up here. It was one by, I think you commented on it, President. And you say in Udo. Yeah, you see it in Udo. And they stated, I missed part of the discussion, but was anything said about the Scottish colonial state and its relation to the whole colonization of Africa? Was that all under British, or did Scotland function as an independent colonial force? And I'm interested in this question because my colonizer family is actually from Scotland.
So I think that's I think that's the thing. There's a misconception that Scotland was a quiet country as part of the UK that didn't really play a hand or play a role in colonisation or imperialism. Glasgow, sorry, that's my kitchen's got a life of its own. Glasgow became the second seat of empire. It made the most wealth and the most money. Ideas around the Scottish Enlightenment happened around about this time. So a lot of wealth came from the enslavement of African people and by Scots who had plantations in Scotland. They played, and again, I think we touched upon like missionaries, Scottish missionaries played a huge part in that as well. So I think the idea that the British were doing this like independently or as part of like a British nation isn't necessarily true. Scotland and the Scots were active in this. Going back to what we said before, it provided jobs. There was a huge period of industrialisation in Scotland, and a lot of the factories were using materials that were coming from plantations, and then the Scottish people have a fondness for sweet things, it's like sugar didn't come from anywhere. So I think there's all these little strands of history that isn't really connecting to the now. It's like how important the rivers were, how important the shipbuilding industry was, how important it was to get the white working class working in also terrible conditions here in Scotland, and in factories, reducing life expectancy. But there's no connection like to that. A lot of the history is sort of hidden behind, merchants, and it doesn't go into like the details of that. Entrepreneurs, merchants, people that were just off doing things, being adventurers without really going into the details. If you look around a lot of the stately homes and a lot of the parks in Glasgow specifically belonged to merchants who, again, were solely responsible for the enslavement of people, of African people. And then when they ran out of money, when there was the so-called abolition of the slave trades, and they then received lots of money in compensation, they couldn't maintain a lot of the lands that they had here. So they gifted it to the cities. But again, it's not really spoken about, like where that came from. So I feel that that's part of the ongoing narrative now, which has just changed, and that we're friendly. We're not like the rest of the UK, specifically England. We're not really British. It's like we're much more welcoming. We understand. There's also some Scots are also of the mindset that Scottish people were colonised by the Brits. So there's also like that little narrative, and trying to like counter / explain that, it is very different. So they acted under the act that took place that united Scotland to the rest of the UK, but individuals within Scotland and as part of the British Empire were undertaking like their own colonial endeavours. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that was a great analysis. I actually have a question. So I've been researching this new theory of the new diaspora, which are, African people coming out of Africa now, going into European countries based on education, job availability, and it's usually the petty bourgeoisie. With your work, have you experienced, like, has there been a change in the demographics in Scotland due to this new diaspora, or has that affected any of the social conditions that you experienced?
I think to study in the UK, particularly as an international student, it's usually treble the tuition fees, if not more, than if you're a home student. So if you're able to study here, without a scholarship, there's an indication that you're coming from money, and there's definitely visibly, and in terms of some stats I've encountered, that there's a lot more students from the diaspora who are coming and studying here. Definitely in terms of like jobs as well, you're seeing where there's a lack of skill set in Scotland, which again goes back to a failing education system. It was a country that used to be considered to have one of the highest levels of literacy, but for the past 50 odd years, it's just been failing like working class people. Most people have very low about reading and writing and arithmetic abilities. So then you're finding that there is like a huge division, right? So Glasgow's going through like a period of, as most places, gentrification, focus on space, which is, masking militarism really, right? But space exploration, we need people that are from that sort of background. And you can see that there's like flats being built along the Clydeside, and they're built to rent. And there's a huge homelessness problem here. I'm trying to figure out how to tie this into your. There's an active campaign to attract people who have skills, high value skills, whilst also at the same time like further marginalizing people that don't have that. And obviously, like with the way in which we understand things, the people who are more likely to be marginalized are going to be those like who are of the diaspora, who are working class and not coming from an educated, moneyed like background. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of strange to see my friend and I have conversations about this and say that you can tell in the ways in which if you try to engage, if you try to speak in certain ways, it's just kind of like, and there's a distancing. And it's just like, okay, so we understand, that even though we're the same, we're not really the same. And it's like we have very different experiences of Glasgow, of Scotland. You're able to move more freely. But obviously, like when it comes to, it's like we'll all be affected in the same way. But yeah, like there's definitely that happening here too.
I
But I
like
was
when
winded way, I think, because I'm getting hungry now.
I like that when you said that they kind of look at you a certain kind of way, that you and I made the same face, like because we already know what the face is.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate this discussion as well, and I the last part, I think the two questions is really telling, and it's just like a icing on the cake of this discussion, which is basically that imperialism is imperialism is imperialism. It doesn't really change, and all of the things that you are talking about in terms of the conditions of African people in Scotland. I mean, we all have an understanding that if we're feeling it here, we're feeling it everywhere, and I think it's really important that we understand what it means for African people in Scotland, in Europe in general, right? To like really feel um, some of the barriers that we are confronted with and by, and and I think there's nuance there too in terms of political education and how we communicate political education so that we can get the most from the people who may be on the fringes, who may not really understand the whole political landscape, and don't even understand themselves too, and how we play a role in this whole political landscape and the kind of power that we have. And I think the more that we're able to instill power by giving people an understanding about who they are, the better. So I just thank you so much, Layla-Roxanne, for being on. That's like a rap name too, Layla-Roxanne. Like, if you are ever going to be a musician, you can do it, Layla-Roxanne. That I want to thank you so much for being a part of our program and just really sharing your experiences, but also your understandings of what's happening in Scotland. And I really hope that we have more opportunities to communicate and to share and to build with one another beyond this program. And we also want to just thank everybody else who came in and out of this program. And we're interested in hearing your thoughts. So definitely leave comments, definitely share, and definitely go to our events page so you can see what more we have in store for you. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and close out. We want to thank everybody, and uhuru means freedom, y'all.